We are also proposing a number of new policies that will improve efficiency, transparency, and accountability, and support students. I want to emphasize from the start that the federal government's unilateral and unexpected decision to cut the number of international students allowed into Canada has caused unnecessary disruption here in Ontario and across the country. But that doesn't change the fact that the federal government's decision was made without consultation and without warning, and without regard for the impact it would have on students and their families. I want to first reassure students and their families, who are already struggling with inflation and rising costs, that we will maintain the current tuition freeze for in-province domestic students for another 3 years. When our government first took office, Ontario had the highest tuition fees in Canada. I am proud that under the leadership of Premier Ford, we have put student affordability front and center by cutting tuition by 10% in 2019 and holding the line against future increases. We are not going to undo that progress by making it more expensive to access education, particularly now when too many Ontario families are already struggling to make ends meet. But of course, we recognize that colleges and universities also need support, which is why we are providing nearly $1.3 billion in new funding. First, the government will be providing $903 million over 3 years through a post-secondary education sustainability fund, with $700 million in broad-based support for all institutions and $203 million in additional top-up funding for institutions with the greatest financial need. It is essential that we support the world-class research being done in our post-secondary institutions, and we are investing more than $65 million to support research and innovation. We're also supporting students in STEM programming with $100 million in new funding, support for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics program costs at institutions with enrollments above current funded levels. We will also be providing nearly $168 million in additional funding for capital renewal and equipment. And in recognition of the unique pressures facing rural and northern institutions, we are providing an additional $10 million top-up for northern universities and small northern and rural colleges. We are also creating an application-based $15 million fund over 3 years to support third-party reviews of post-secondary institutions to help them improve operational and financial efficiency. And finally, we are providing a total of $23 million to support student mental health and introducing legislation that would require colleges and universities to have mental health policies in place that let students know about the supports that are available to them. This legislation will require institutions to have an accessible and a responsive reporting system where students feel safe to report instances of hatred and racism at Ontario's post-secondary institutions. It will also protect students against hidden fees for textbooks by authorizing directives to be issued to colleges and universities requiring these costs to be made public in advance. And my ministry will be working with post-secondary institutions to improve tuition fee transparency so students know how their hard-earned money is being spent. Furthermore, as recommended by the Blue Ribbon panel, we will mandate core competencies for board members of colleges and universities, including financial literacy and risk management. And finally, we are introducing several new measures that will help provide students with the skills they need to succeed in the job market. This includes allowing colleges to offer master's degrees in applied areas of study to help students graduate with in-demand skills and expertise, and the creation of a new career portal to improve access to information about education and career opportunities across the province. This is a broad range of measures that will offer much-needed stability to the post-secondary sector and help keep costs down for students and their families. Ultimately, our goal is to put students and their needs first, while continuing to produce the world-class graduates Ontario is so well known for. The legislation I have introduced today, along with the historic investments our government is making, is a clear demonstration of our continued commitment to Ontario's colleges, universities, and most importantly, the students. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
This is quite the change of tone. You went from saying that you were going to work hand in hand with the government on this file, and now you're talking about it being a unilateral decision and quite disruptive. So, yes or no, do you disagree with the federal government's decision to cap international students?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And absolutely, the decision was made by the federal government, was a unilateral decision with absolutely no consultation with the provinces or the sector.
That's not an answer.
Do you have a list of, was that a yes or a no?
Well, thank you very much for the question. As I said, I've been very disturbed by the lack of consultation the federal government has made. Absolutely no consultation with the provinces, with the sector, but we are working with the sector, and I will be responding to the directive that is made by the federal government before the March 31st deadline.
Minister, you keep talking about the federal government's move about the student visas, but are we not here today responding to the Blue Ribbon panel, which was all about the problems that the province has created in the post-secondary sector, the tuition freeze that has caused stagnant revenues for them and low and very low levels of operating grants. Those are all provincial issues.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And that's what we are here today, talking about the largest, it's a historic investment, $1.3 billion package, new funding to support colleges and universities in this province. I want to thank the Blue Ribbon panel for the recommendations that were made. And the theme of that the recommendations were the shared responsibility of the post-secondary institutions, the government, and students. Today, the government is responding by introducing $1.3 billion in new funding to ensure sustainability, predictability for institutions. We are also announcing a $15 million fund, efficiency fund, so that schools can find the efficiencies. But what I will not apologize for is the tuition freeze. We are having an affordability crisis in this province and across Canada. We are not going to put this on the backs of students. We're hearing from far too many students the cost of living, the cost of gas, of rent. So the increases that we're making today to ensure that our schools have sustainability and predictability moving forward will not be on the backs of students.
I understand you're maintaining that tuition freeze, but Minister, was there ever a recommendation that tuition be increased?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and that was a recommendation by the panel. But I will not apologize for continuing to freeze tuition in this province. The Premier has been made very clear that this is an affordability issue. We will continue the tuition freeze for the next 3 years. But let me take you back to 2019, when Ontario had the highest tuition in all of Canada. We made the decision at that time to decrease tuition by 10% and to freeze the tuition at that time. We will continue that tuition freeze for the next 3 years to ensure affordability for any student entering post-secondary in Ontario.
One of the things the Blue Ribbon panel talked about was a longer view of funding. You're just talking about a one-time cash infusion over 3 years. So where's the discussion going after these 3 years? Is there any talk at this point about what happens at the end to make sure that colleges, universities aren't coming cap in hand to Queen's Park after that?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And today's announcement is a historic investment of $1.3 billion in post-secondary. We want to give schools the sustainability, the predictability in there's a plan, their path forward. But we're not doing this on the backs of students. We are going to ensure tuition is frozen for an additional 3 years so that students have access to post-secondary education in this province.
Minister, the recommendation was actually for increases that would have amounted to $2.5 billion. So without talking about tuition, why is your government not increasing funding, direct funding to colleges and universities by $2.5 billion like was recommended by the panel?
Today I'm announcing $1.3 billion in new spending for post-secondary institutions in Ontario. This is a historic investment. We have not seen this in over a decade. This is going to ensure predictability and sustainability for our institutions here in Ontario,
How is it
but
going to
not
do
on
that?
the backs of students.
How is it going to do that, given that you're also facing potentially over $1 billion, maybe $2 billion in lost revenue from the cap on international students? What are you going to do to make up for that funding?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And again, $1.3 billion, not on the backs of students. But I think what we're also not addressing today is the special supports that we are going to be providing for students. We have not seen an anti-hate policy on campuses. And I'm sure many of you have reported anti-hate stories. And you know where I hear those stories from? From the media. These are not reported to the ministry themselves. We will be working with Colleges Ontario and Council of Universities to ensure that there's a policy in place on campus for reporting of anti-hate. I heard far too often from students and from faculty on campuses that when these reports were made, nothing happened. There was no reporting mechanism back to the province. We will work closely with the institutions to ensure a standardized approach to anti-hate reporting.
Minister, you're not actually answering the questions, Minister. Minister, you're not answering. You're not addressing the
taking this
questions.
question right here,
the question was, what are you going to do to make up for the loss of international student revenue?
What I'm doing today is investing $1.3 billion. We have, as part of that $1.3 billion package, there's a $903 million sustainability fund that all institutions will be able to access, with $203 million specifically for those schools identified at medium or high risk. $100 million for 13,000 STEM students in this province. We want to ensure that students are graduating into the in-demand jobs that we have in this province. Another $10 million for the northern and rural and small colleges and universities as a one-time addition to their funding. You know, we have a great announcement today, historic $1.3 billion. I think that's what we're failing to message.
You haven't even said the words international students. Can you please address the international students?
Well, thank you for the question on international students, and I have been very clear in my disappointment on the federal government's unilateral decision to make this decision on schools and the province with no consultation. This is going to have an impact on the economy, not just here in Ontario, but across Canada. So today's investment, yes, we recognize the disruption that the international student announcement has made from the federal government, and we also recognize the challenges through COVID. But today's announcement is the government stepping up and providing $1.3 billion in supports for post-secondary education in this province.
Why do you appoint a blue ribbon panel and not listen to what it says?
Well, I
The
think
colleges asked for way more. The blue ribbon panel recommended way more, but you're not doing that. So you can say historic investment all you want, but you're falling way low of what the schools have asked for.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And, you know, we worked, I thank the Blue Ribbon Panel for the recommendations. They worked very diligently in the past months, consulted with the institutions, and looked at several submissions from not only institutions, but also from various industries across Ontario. But, you know, I am not going to apologize for not increasing tuition in this province, as was one of the recommendations from the Blue Ribbon Panel. This is an affordability issue, and we've heard very loud and clear from the Premier, we are not going to increase tuition. Now is not the time. There's an affordability crisis in this province. Students are, you know, actually I have a quote here from the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. The decision to maintain the domestic tuition freeze for the next 3 years is very welcoming news to students. Amid a cost of living crisis and limited opportunities for income, this move will help with post-secondary affordability and allow students to put money towards basic necessities like rent and food. We appreciate the ministry's consideration of this and look forward to having more conversations about other wraparound and sustainable avenues to support students. So I think the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance
on public-private partnership campuses. But the government removed a moratorium put in place by the Liberals at the start of your term. Is that an admission that undoing that Liberal moratorium was a mistake that contributed to this problem?
Well, thank you for the question. And my job as Minister of Colleges and Universities is to ensure that we have high-quality programs that are here for students that meet labor market demands. And when international students come to this province, we want to ensure the quality in the programming, that it leads to jobs, but that students are also supported through that process.
Doesn't it suggest then that the federal government had a legitimate reason for doing this decision? Because you seem to admit in the legislation that it's a problem that you need to put a stop to in the form of a moratorium. So was the federal government right to put this cap in place?
Well, quite frankly, the federal government did not consult with the provinces or the institutions themselves. You know, we worked very diligently with all of our institutions in Ontario to assure high quality access to education and supports for students during that time.
Did you ever consider it get out of hand, Minister? Did you let this get out of hand on international students? Because beyond the private-public partnerships, you've got some colleges that are over 50% international students. That seemed unsustainable. Was no one watching what was happening?
Thank you for the question. And my concern is over the lack of consultations from the federal government. This was dropped on us. The Minister of Labour and I have been asking the Minister responsible for a meeting for months to discuss, but that was denied. But what we are doing is ensuring today that we have supports in place, not only for students, but for post-secondary education, a $1.3 billion investment.
That's a very different question, Minister. I asked, did you let it get out of hand? Conestoga College, more than 50% international students. Is that a sustainable model?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And again, the federal government made these decisions. Lack of consultation with any of the provinces, of any of the institutions. And I wasn't just hearing from institutions themselves, I was also hearing from some of our labour partners. The impact that this is going to have, not only in Ontario, but across Canada. Hospitality and tourism, skilled trades, health human resources. These are our priority programs. We need to ensure that we have access to a talented market of labour line.
Minister, out of the $900 million, the Blue Ribbon panel said there needs to be some kind of differentiation between colleges and universities. So how are you going to decide who gets what? Are colleges going to get some kind of special treatment here?
Thank you for the question. Of the $903 million, $700 million will be specific. Each individual institution will receive a piece of that allocation. The 200, that's very technical. We're working with each individual institution on that. The $203 million will be specific to schools that the ministry identifies as high and medium risk. And we have financial health matrix that we follow for that.
Minister, how much of the budget will be allocated to helping disabled students, such as those with learning disabilities, reading disabilities, or issues navigating on campus?
Well, thank you for that question. And the $1.3 billion package today that we are announcing in new funding for colleges and universities, I will say that question very specifically, institutions are autonomous and how they spend that money will be fitting. Part of the announcement today is the mental health supports as well. There is no framework in place at campuses across Ontario. So we want to ensure, because we know this has been a difficult time for students. And I can tell you, I'm a mother of daughters who are in post-secondary. The mental health issues on our campuses are real. The mental health framework that we will work with all campuses to standardize the approach to ensure that students know where to find those supports.
What do
you make of this?
About learning disabilities, accommodation, someone in a wheelchair in a campus that has a bunch of stairs, or someone with dyslexia, that's not a mental health issue, that's a learning disability. I'm asking specifically how much of the budget will go towards accommodating students with learning disabilities or physical disabilities, not just mental health issues.
Well, thank you for the question. And because institutions are autonomous, they will be making those specific decisions about the spending within their own institution.
What do you think about the striking York?
Despite the tuition cuts, we're still seeing people spend more and more money, students that you're saying you want to protect, on their tuition, which means they're going further and further into debt since that tuition freeze was in place. So I want to ask you, is your government going to be looking at OSAP regulation, potentially giving more in grants and less in loans? Because that was a big factor in why the debts keep going up.
Well, thank you very much for that question. That's actually something I would really like to address that is part of the legislation, is a tuition fee transparency. Through legislation, we are asking the colleges and universities, when they post tuition, to have all of the fees included in that. That includes the ancillary fees. We are also, through legislation, programs will need to list all the costs associated, so that the cost of textbooks, any associated costs with subscriptions or with additional materials, lab materials that might be required. We recognize the cost of tuition for students in this province, and I've heard from students who are saying, we understand that tuition has been frozen, but yet we still see an increase. So we want schools to be transparent with the breakdown on what tuition expenses are, because this is students' hard-earned dollars. For some people, this is the first big investment that they're making in their lifetime. We know there's an affordability crisis. We want to ensure, and I want to ensure as the minister, as does the premier, that access to education in this province is affordable for all students.
What do you make of the strike at York University? Will the government intervene?
Northern and rural, which institutions, because I don't think that was specified in the documents that we received.
Oh, thank you very much for the question. And so this is an additional $10 million top-up for the Northern grant for the Northern universities and the small Northern and rural colleges. So it's very specific on the institutions that already received that. So they currently receive that funding, and this will be an additional $10 million top-up.
Minister, will the government intervene in the strike that's going on at York University?
Well, schools are autonomous. Thank you very much for the question. And, I call on both sides of the strike to come to the table and ensure that we do not disrupt student learning on campuses.
Minister,
question.
is this 1.3 billion going to be enough? To Mike's question earlier, it's less than the colleges and universities had asked for. It's less than your own government commission panel recommended. Are you confident that this is going to be enough to sustain the sector?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And today's historic investment of $1.3 billion is the government's response. And as I said before, the panel talks about this is a shared responsibility. So this is government's responsibility, stepping up, providing the funding. But what we're also doing is providing the $15 million efficiency fund so that universities and colleges can find efficiencies within their own institutions. So I look forward to working with all of our partners as we move forward. Thank you very much.
You think they can find $1 billion?